This is a religious season in the United States and elsewhere. Easter is this Sunday, and Passover holiday is occurring right now. And the key question that animates the Passover holiday is the question to which the entire ritual responds. And that question is, why is this night different from all other nights? It's a wonderful comparative question that us political scientists love to hear, because it makes one say, what's going on here? How is what's happening now different than other times? Why should we pay attention? I like that question because it also applies to events like the upcoming European Parliament elections. These are not the first elections. They began in 1979. But it is reasonable for us to ask, what is different about these elections? What will be the impact of those results? Why should we take note of those results? I have some, what I would call, candidate answers as to why we should pay attention. And I'd like to mention those and then turn to our panelists. First, of course, the European Parliament is the most democratic of the EU institutions, reflecting most directly public attitudes. That's not new, but this year there seemed to be a change in public attitudes toward the European Union, not in a positive direction, and we might wonder to what extent those will be reflected in the elections. Second, this is the largest election ever held by the European Parliament. No fewer than 28 member countries with more than 400 million voters will take place. It is logical then for us to wonder whether there will be differences among the member states and their populations, especially old and new members, long-standing and new members. Third, this is often referred to as the first genuine European election. And honestly, I'm not sure what that means. I'm going to ask our panelists to address this question. Is it refer to preparation, to campaigning? How is that different than previous elections? If it is the most democratic and the most European elections, what are we to make by the resurgence of right-wing parties all over Europe, both old and new, in Hungary, in France, in Greece, in the Netherlands? We see the appearance of right-wing parties which display a profound anti-EU attitude, or at least appeal to. We have also seen it, of course, in major European Union actors like the UK. Putting all of these things together, we wonder if this election will ironically produce the most anti-EU parliament that we have ever seen. This is significant for another reason. The European Parliament, this is the first set of elections to take place after the Lisbon Treaty went into effect, granting the European Parliament new powers. So this newly elected body, reflecting changing attitudes, will also have new power. Two more possibilities, and you can see why I like the question focusing on the difference. We have seen an atmosphere of what analysts call renationalization of politics and policy in the European Union. And I wonder if that will be, if the European elections will be a reflection of that or a cause going forward. If so, will that affect the ability of the European Union to act effectively as it needs to towards what you might call domestic issues, economic growth, climate change, migration, And will it affect the ability of the organization to act globally as a steadfast ally and an actor on the European stage? There are a lot more questions, of course. Those are only a few that come to mind. And it would be good to have some experts to address them. Fortunately, we have those with us today, and I'd like to introduce them. From Oxford, Professor Catherine de Vries, who is from the Department of Politics and International Relations at Oxford, where she is Professor of European Politics. She is editor of Research and Politics, and very well known for her publications, which are devoted to political parties and the European Union, including a forthcoming article on measuring party positions in Europe, a forthcoming volume on In Europe We Trust, ? An already published volume on ambivalent Europeans, public support for European integration in East and West. Obviously, someone well qualified to address these questions. Along those same lines, Dr. Barbara Gunz from Corvinus University in Budapest is with us. She received her PhD from Corvinus University and is currently a research fellow there, focusing on issues especially of attitudes of the public, especially in East Europe, towards the EU. Her recent publications include a chapter in a volume, Persistent East-West Divide, the Effect of the Crisis on People's Perceptions of the European Union, and Perception of the European Integration in CEE countries. Joining us from Illinois is Konstantinos, or as we know him, Kostas Kortikakis, and I checked the pronunciation with Eleni, so I know I'm right on that, from the Department of Political Science at the University of Illinois. He is extremely well educated, having received his PhD from the University of Pittsburgh, and also having worked at the center. And his publications focus on a number of issues related to the European Union, including imitation and supranational politics, some lessons from the European Ombudsman and European Court of Auditors, and a forthcoming book on imitation and supranational politics. In addition, his work focuses on networking, and so I'm alerting him to the fact that I may ask him to comment on the use of social media and in this election. Joining us from South Carolina is Will Daniel, also well educated, having received his PhD even more recently from Pitt. He is assistant professor in the Department of Political Science and Geography at Francis Marion University, and the author of All Roads Lead Through Brussels, Career Behavior and the European Parliament, and an article in the Journal of Common Market Studies on When the Agent Knows Better Than the Principal, Effective Education and Seniority on European Parliament Rapporteur Assignment. He has a paper coming out, which is particularly attractive for this topic, called Rational Parties, Radical Voters, Extremist Party Recruitment Strategies at the National and European Levels. So, with your permission, I would like to address a question, and actually I'm going to start with you, Will. You're at the center of my screen. Would you address, please, the nature of the new powers of the European Parliament and how significant those will be regardless of the outcome of the elections?
Well, thanks, Ron, and hopefully if you can't hear me, I don't think we have the muting abilities over here, so just wave at me and I'll wait. But anyway, I guess the big thing I would notice about new powers within the Parliament, and to be honest, it's not an extremely large institutional development with the Lisbon Treaty, but one thing that does seem to matter a lot more, and probably Kostas can speak to this, is the increased amount of publicity that these parties and campaigns are getting across countries in Europe. Mostly as a result, I would say, because of the link between the votes in the European Parliament elections and their responsibility, or at least their assumed responsibility for sort of pointing out the new Commission president. So that's a new function of the European elections, and a lot of the candidates for this Commission presidency have come from European Parliament backgrounds. Of course, most notably Martin Schulz, the current president of the European Parliament, who is sort of taking on the socialist campaign, pan-European speaking. So, we've seen him cropping up a lot of different places. It's interesting. He just had this speaks to the far right party's question as well. He just was invited to participate in a debate with Marine Le Pen on France National Television. Of course, the leader of the far right National Front Party, and she declined to debate with him and instead sort of debated herself using positions that she assumed that he or other mainline parties might take or might have taken. So that's interesting in and of itself. It's not really a consequence of new institutional powers, so to say, but certainly a feeling that these elections matter not just within one country, but for all of Europe more generally.
Kostas, do you want to pick up on that? Make sure you're unmuted.
I am.
Yes, the question has to do with new institutional powers that will accrue to this parliament, regardless of the outcome, and what their impact might be.
What I find very interesting about the institutional power question is the fact that I agree with Will. I don't see that the new institutional powers of the parliament are fundamentally different, especially the selection process of the commission president. There has been some version of that there in the past. It was just not as institutionalized as it is now. But what I find interesting about this tendency is that we have this allusion, if you want, to parliamentary democracy that happens. So it seems like what the EU is trying to do, or those people who make decisions in the EU and try to design EU institutions, are trying to relate the European Union to European citizens by constructing a system of selecting executive and legislature that looks kind of like what the parliamentary systems in the member states look. So I found that very interesting that now it has become a big deal, the fact that the president of the European Commission absolutely must have the support of the group that has the majority in the European Parliament, which is a classic situation of a vote of confidence. And that has been there in the past, I think, but it's become now much more prominent. I think it's part of this effort by the EU to increase its legitimacy by making these references to parliamentary democracy.
Professor De Vries, I can't see you, but I know you're there. Do you think that this change, either the one that, there we are, the one that Kostas described and Will mentioned, or other changes, will have an impact on the turnout for these elections, which, as you well know, has been declining for some time, reaching a low of, I think, 43% in the most recent, despite the fact that in some countries voting is obligatory? Or will there be no impact and will the decline continue? Yeah, we can't hear you.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Yes. Thank you very much, by the way, for a very intriguing discussion. I think it's very difficult for political scientists to make any prediction about elections and turnout especially. But if turnout would go up in this election, I fear that not due to anything that will happen from the European Parliament, but actually due to mobilization of parties that are not very pro-European, and that might actually, after the crisis, spark off turnout a little bit, which is a kind of a paradoxical consequence. I don't think for many voters, at least what we get from opinion surveys, that it's at all clear who is leader of particular party groups like Martin Schulz. Not many Germans. Besides Germans, not many other people have actually heard of him. So I think in that way, that change won't do as much. I think the mobilization of some anti-European parties might spark off turnout a little bit more.
Dr. Gunz, is that the same? You expect the same dynamic in East Europe, that the turnout will be a reflection of mobilization of anti-EU, or is there attention to the new powers and the new role of the Parliament and the European citizen?
Okay, now can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, so first of all, I would also like to thank the possibility to participate in this discussion. And I would totally agree with Catherine de Vries related to this high effect or the most important effect of national parties in mobilization. Now, if we take Eastern or new member states into account, there is one thing that we have to take into account is that traditionally here mobilization or participation to European elections is lower than in other member states. Usually it is true for all the countries, maybe some Baltic countries are the exceptions, but participation rates might be very low, especially, I don't know, in Slovakia during the two last time, it was like 20%. So it is really kind of secondary order elections. In these countries, this is very true. And here, it's maybe not even, well, obviously, European Union triggers maybe less attention in these countries, but also here we have to deal with some kind of state socialist heritage. And it's about, you know, the lower level of political activity in general. So in these countries, I don't know if there will be any change compared to previous waves, but certainly the level of participation will be lower than in other member states.
Dr. Götz, let me stay with you for a moment. We know that the recent changes in Hungary with the emergence of Fidesz into a majority and a supermajority have led to clashes with Brussels over some of its policies, seen as attempts to manipulate the electoral system or dominate the judiciary or muzzle the media. Hungary is not alone in that, but Hungary was singled out for criticism, actually fairly harsh criticism, by the European Parliament. My question is, did that, in the recent elections, was that kind of challenge an issue? Did people react to that? Did either Fidesz or what we would consider far-right Jobbik party use that as part of their election campaign?
Yes. Well, where I should maybe start because now we had recent elections like a week and a half ago, where Fidesz just restored their power with the same two-thirds majority in the parliament. So basically, there was no big change compared to the previous parliament. Maybe change in the increased votes towards Jobbik, the far-right party in Hungary. But I would go back to 2010 when the Fidesz previously won the elections, because until 2010 the main political discourse of the old left liberal government was very pragmatic towards Europe, and it was very much related to technicalities and policies and it was very pragmatic, and that was reflected in the public opinion as well. So people would have very pragmatic discourses on the European Union if they had any. Then in 2010, starting in 2010, the majority discourse on the European Union, or the governmental discourse on the European Union, has changed significantly. Since then, we have a lot of symbolic messages, comparing Brussels to Moscow, comparing Brussels to Vienna, for example, as a reference to restore the past history, and that might have affected public opinion as well. But in terms of the data, when we're looking at the share of people supporting the Hungary's EU membership, There is a decline, but the decline is not that significant. So maybe this kind of change of the discourse will have an effect in the longer term. We don't know yet. As my personal experience is that people are still trying to be very pragmatic about the EU, that it's very much about cost-benefit analysis. But on the other hand, there started, well, all these very symbolic messages will certainly start to have an effect on that. And certainly Jobbik has a very anti-EU discourse. I mean, it's not very consistent always, but sometimes they are even calling for referendum to leave the EU. Then some other members of the Jobbik don't exactly do that, but sometimes we can find that.
And Jobbik is putting forth candidates in the European Parliament elections, are they not?
Yes, exactly. In 2000, in 2004, they didn't participate to European elections because of the rejection of the whole idea of the European Union. But starting from 2009, they have participated, and actually in 2009 it was kind of a test for the upcoming national elections. And then they already had 3 MEPs in the parliament they have now, and probably now the number of their MEPs will increase for this next term.
Thank you. I have a signal from the European Parliament office that someone there would like to join us.
Yes. Hi. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Hi. I would like I have 2 or 3 points to say. So the reason why these elections are, you're right, different this time, it's mostly because of what happened during the crisis. What happened during the crisis is that a number of member states, and I would be a bit provocative here, a number of member states didn't do their homework. Didn't do the reforms that they should have done. Some countries in the EU have done them, some others have not done them. And the problem is that when the Eurozone members created the euro, they did make sure they had the governance tools to make it work. So the day the member states who didn't do their homework were in trouble, well, everybody had to put the money in the pocket and everybody had to show solidarity. And that really showed to our 500 million people that it's not anymore a question of national sovereignty on certain big issues like the economy, like the energy, like a number of big climate or big horizontal issues are now have to be dealt on the European level. And that means that now the EU has taken in the last year with the crisis very important decisions that impact on the life of people. It's not anymore that we decide on technical measures, but we now have a say on the national budget. So we really have a say in Brussels. And when I say in Brussels, it's the member states and the European Parliament, who are all legitimate because they are all, I mean, the governments are elected, come from the majorities in their national member state, and the European Parliament is directly elected. So people realize that there's a lot now of decisions being made in Brussels. But people have the feeling that these decisions that are being taken in Brussels are not legitimate. They have the feeling that is very well, the member states, every time they go, the ministers, when they come to Brussels, they take a decision with their colleagues, and then this decision will be or not endorsed or amended by the parliament. But when they come back home, they say, oh, it's not me, it's them in Brussels. A bit like what happens so there's a lot of Brussels bashing. So these elections are the moments when the citizens can really have their say, and not only can they choose their MEPs, but also they can, after a conversation that we will have during this campaign, hopefully a European conversation on a pan-European level, the citizens will have the possibility to vote on who the president of the Commission will be and which policy he will implement.
Professor De Vries, do you agree with Mr. Ripoli's assessment of the significance of the crisis in European public attitude towards the EU, Or alternatively, is that just been an acceleration of a long-term decline? In particular, I'm interested in the attitudes of trust and favorability.
Yeah, I think well, it's a very academic cop-out to say it's a bit of both, but I think the EU, what citizens seem to suggest, and or what opinion polls seem to suggest, is that people hold the EU much more responsible for policy outcomes. So also things that happen at the national level. However, even though what was said before, people have the same European parliamentary elections, these parliamentary elections don't produce governments. Even it's unclear if the candidate will actually become commission president. That's something that's suggested, but it's going to be the first time. We'll see if that's going to happen. And I think a lot of people have the idea that they can't throw the rascals out, if you will, in Brussels, as one could do nationally. And what people then are left with is actually withdrawing trust from the system. So if things are going badly in their own countries and badly in Brussels, and they indeed, maybe through national media, maybe through the national politicians, think that Brussels partly is responsible for that, they don't necessarily have the idea, if I vote, let's say, a social democrat in power in Brussels, that I'm going to see social democratic policy coming out of Brussels. And that kind of disconnect makes it very difficult. So maybe for then a voter says, well, if that's not going to happen in Brussels, then I'm going to withdraw from that system as such. And I think some of that one is seen happening. And that's not necessarily new. That's something one saw also in the aftermath of the constitutional treaty referenda in France and the Netherlands. So in that way, it's also what you suggest, maybe also an acceleration of a process that was going on before that. But the crisis surely has accelerated that.
Kostas, let me come back to you, because what Professor de Vries just said seems to suggest that the ability to make this an exercise in citizenship and reinforcing citizenship has not succeeded or is not likely to succeed, despite the fact that it's the largest election and the most European campaigning. These issues, I guess it would be, are preventing this from being achieved, or is that a misreading of it?
I think to go off what Professor de Vries was saying earlier, there seems to be an effort, maybe not very successful, but there is an effort to create the sense that citizens are voting for political parties, and through political parties, they exercise rights to citizenship in a way, right? So they can elect government and hold governments accountable. But I think what I find interesting about the EU and the way the EU is doing this seems it's happening not in an organic way, but in a very artificial way. So it seems like political parties are not sort of coming spontaneously out of this system, or they haven't been created spontaneously and then they're somehow engaged in this political process. But it looks to me as if the EU or certain people in Brussels are really trying to create these pan-European parties. Now, there is nothing wrong with that. I think it is a good idea, but it seems to me that citizens are aware of that. At least that's the sense that I get from observing and trying to understand the situation from the United States, that these political parties and all these elections of the president, they seem to be kind of artificial in a way. So, and the outcome of that is sometimes citizens do not really relate to them. So they feel like, well, I do know what the Socialist Party of France is, or of Germany, so I'll vote for them as opposed to this new entity that I'm not very familiar with, and I don't know if they will really advocate for my interests. So I think, but I think the process is starting, right? It has to start from somewhere, and I found it actually very, very interesting. I follow the Greek elections very, very closely for obvious reasons, and I noticed that there's many new political parties that are being formed in Greece, and whenever a new party is formed, the candidate for the commission office from that parliamentary group, from the equivalent parliamentary group, will go and try to talk to the convention and try to relate to those new parties. So I thought it's interesting that the European Union or certain actors in the EU are constantly trying to create these pan-European parties, but it seems like the process is a little bit obvious.
Actually, let me pick up on your last point and ask Will to comment on. We have paid a lot of attention, and we will continue to the growth of right-wing parties, such as the Golden Dawn in Greece and Jobbik in Hungary. But isn't an equally significant effect the impact of these parties have on mainstream conservative parties, pulling them to the right, especially with regard to the EU, pushing them to take more hostile or prickly stances with regard to Brussels in order to not lose support to the right?
Yeah, I think that's a good general read. I guess the big problem or big complication with looking at these right-wing parties, or really any sort of fringe or populist parties, they're not all the same. You can't paint them with the same brush across all countries as you might be able to relate a French socialist to a German socialist. There are some parties in this sort of category, very nebulous category of right-wing or sort of populist fringe parties that would like to work internationally. I'm thinking of Nigel Farage was in France the other day, not supporting Marine Le Pen, but supporting other French parties that might join his group, the FD. There are some that already work with him in Brussels. Then there are others that are ending up in the NI group once they get to the European Parliament group. In other words, they don't form a parliamentary group, or they don't participate transnationally, either because they can't get along, because they don't agree on the same policies across countries, or because they simply don't see the utility of doing so in the European Parliament. So it makes it very difficult to generalize about what the impact of these far right or populist parties might have on mainstream conservative parties. It's certainly a good read for probably what's going to happen with the French elections, and probably what's going to happen with the UK elections in terms of losses to Conservative Party and the UMP, but I'm not sure if it would work the same way in all national contexts.
That actually leads me to a question I posed to all of you ahead of time, which was the degree to which this upsurge in right-wing parties, for lack of a better, or a sort of a collective term, is a reflection of, and Professor De Vries, you made reference to this, that it's really a reflection of people being unhappy with their national politicians. Can you, Professor De Vries, give us some idea of what are they unhappy about, and why do they lay it at the feet of the EU?
So it's very important, and I want to reiterate that if you look, for example, many people are highlighting the lack of trust, or the decline in trust in EU institutions since the crisis. The decline in trust in national governments is far greater than the EU. So that way, that gives a kind of an interesting paradox. So what might people not be happy about with the EU? I think, especially in Western Europe, and I'm going to keep it for Barbola to talk more about Eastern Europe, but especially in Western Europe, it's the combination, I think, of a free market that they don't necessarily have the ideas in favor of them. And it's in two respects that they don't think it's always in favor of them. You know that elites in Europe, and there's been many studies about that, favor free market out of functional reasons, efficiency reasons. People actually would like to have the free market or have something of a mechanism that protects them against economic shocks. And I think the financial crisis kind of bore out that, hey, the euro might not be that, and not saying that it's not, right, but just that people have the idea that it made it worse for them. So that's one. And then the other element is that the free market brings also people from different cultures that come and work in your country, which lines up with a lot of fears about immigration and about people who are other than yourself. And that's what you see very strongly in Britain, in France, in the Netherlands, in Denmark, especially geared towards Bulgarians and Romanians. And I think those two elements, so one, a idea of lack of social policy coming out of the European Union, and the other part is the EU being partly responsible for increased shocks of immigration recently, which which according to many people is not, in many ordinary citizens is not desirable, I think makes it an easy target for right-wing parties or right-wing populist parties, however we want to call them, and to say, well, this is what the EU is doing to you, it's selling you out, it's actually not in your interest.
I want to get to Dr. Gunz in a minute because, like you, I want to hear what she has to say about Easter. But let me follow up with you directly first on the first point. If there was a fear of the exigencies of the market that were driving people and they wanted protection, wouldn't that push them to the left rather than the right? And shouldn't we therefore be seeing an upsurge in left-oriented parties when in fact we're not?
So that's the idea of I think that's the crisis of social democracy, that social democracy for a long time in Europe has been responsible for enormous deregulation, financial deregulation. The third way in Western Europe is seen as actually that the social democrats have sold out. What you do see, for example, in the Netherlands and Germany, is strong socialist parties, the parties to the left of the social democrats. And also many parties, like, for example, Wilders in the Netherlands, they are anti-immigrant and they are pro-welfare state. So actually you see parties on the extreme right mobilizing two elements, which has been the same for the Danish People's Party, the same as what Marine Le Pen is doing, and the same what Geert Wilders is doing in the Netherlands. That actually they are the saviors, if you will, of the welfare state and not the Social Democrats.
Wow. Dr. Gunz, would you like to comment on that in the countries of Central and East Europe, the new members?
Yeah. Yes, so I fully agree with what Catherine de Vries said, and these dynamics can be found in new member states as well, according to my research and the work that we are doing with my colleagues. There are a few specificities that I would like to underline that are a little bit different in these new member states. First of all, these countries joined the EU. Well, the public opinion and public attitudes were very, very enthusiastic about these accession to the European Union, and there were very high expectations towards economic development and towards the stabilization of the democratic system. And now with the effects of the crisis, or in some countries like in Hungary, it's not just the effects of the crisis, but there is our own economic crisis even before the crisis. So people just realize that this might not work so quickly. So there is kind of a loss of enthusiasm in these countries that might feed anti-European feelings, for example. And also that people realize that, or there are feelings of some kind of secondary membership, that the EU was dictating a lot of things let's say to us, people might think, and now it wasn't working. So maybe it's high time to find our own ways to deal with things. And this is the main discourse actually that the Prime Minister of Hungary is often having, this kind of return to take back our sovereignty and not to do as the EU dictates. That is, I think, very important and a little bit different. And then I very much agree that there are this dynamic of extrapolating or attitudes towards the domestic context, political and economic performance, to extrapolate these kind of evaluations to the EU. But in these countries, sometimes we find a different kind of logic. Like, for example, less I trust domestic institutions, more I will trust European institutions. Or more I am dissatisfied with the economic performance of my country, I will be more in favor of more Europe, for example. So there is this kind of compensating logic also at place. Like recently, I just heard that, for example, in Bulgaria, this trust is really present, and this for the trust. Something more that Catherine de Vries mentioned, that the loss of trust was even more present towards national institutions in other member states. Well, in these countries where already trust towards national institutions were already very low, according to statistics, what we found is that it couldn't decrease so much because it was already very low. So maybe this is not so present in this. And just one more thing that which is also very different and which has also implications towards how these far right parties look like in this part of Europe, is that, for example, the immigration question is not such an important social problem here, especially in Hungary, but in other countries it's not important either. So this kind of fear of immigration logic is not that much present in these countries. Nevertheless, these are or attitudes that can be very xenophobic, but without the real social problem behind. On the other hand, there are other problems, like also kind of integration problems, like the Roma problem in Hungary. So we have it's a very important social problem that is eventually it is not present in all the member states, but it shapes how far right party is, especially the Jobbik, for example, looks like in this part of Europe. So this is what I just wanted to add.
Will, let me come back to you. To what extent does the EU form a convenient scapegoat for governments which are dealing with problems that perhaps they cannot effectively deal with, like the Roma or immigration, and they turn to their voters and their public and they say, well, it's not our fault, it's because of Brussels. And in a sense, they're boosting or trying to boost their own stock by blaming things on Brussels. Is that a factor in this shaping of attitudes, do you think?
I mean, I think that's certainly probably true, maybe not by the national governments themselves, but by certain political parties within these countries, right? That's a main platform issue, especially on some of these non-far right and yet still populist parties, sort of like, I guess you could say, for example, the domestic government has failed because of Brussels, and so we should blame Brussels. I'm not sure. I wouldn't know of an obvious example to point to for a domestic government that's in leadership and blames Brussels directly for their problems, but that certainly seems to be a lot of what's fueling public opinion for these more protest-oriented or fringe parties, for sure.
Kostas, does that happen in Greece? Well, just a second while we unmute you.
Yeah, it does to a significant extent. I think to more of an extent than most people recognize outside of Greece, that there is a lot of introspection going on, but there is definitely some blaming, not so much the EU, but particular countries in the European Union. But what I think is very interesting is that for the first time, parties that are anti-EU have been able to make a very convincing argument against the EU, because anti-EU arguments have been around for a very long time. But the traditional approach of mainstream parties is that we're all in this together, we're all working together, this is a European project, and we're all part of it. And I think probably because of the crisis, the argument that this is not really a European project, this is somebody's project that's imposed upon us, and so we need to react to it. I think this argument has gained a lot of traction. Again, this argument has been around for a long time. So I personally remember, right-wing parties in the Netherlands or in Greece or elsewhere making that argument, but everybody thought that they were crazy or they were on the fringes or that they were definitely not they were not representing the mainstream view of the EU. And so the mainstream view has been sort of this idea that they're the founding fathers that created the European Union, everybody is walking together into a better future, and it's everybody's part of that. And now I see for the first time citizens and parties that say, no, this is just somebody's vision and it's not our nation's vision. And that's gained traction. A lot of people now believe in that. And so that, I think, what I see a lot of the Greek political parties, both on the left, because I would like to point out that Greece has a party that's radical and on the left, and what it has in common with parties on the extreme right is that exact rhetoric, that this is not a project for the nation, this is a project that has been imposed on the nation by somebody else.
Professor De Vries, let me come back to you because several commentators now have talked about parties. And this is obviously the focus of your work. And it's always struck me as a student of populism that you have some parties which are kind of hitchhikers on the road of causes. They don't really believe in the anti-EU message, but it's a convenient message to use. I think it was Paul Taggart called it the empty heart of populism. There's no real ideology there, but it's convenient. By the same token, you also have parties which really are deeply hostile to, let's say, the European project. Can you give us a sort of view of the landscape and to some idea of what we're likely to see in the European elections that reflects that? Or maybe has one category of those disappeared and they're now merged?
So I think following up on what was just said about how the crisis has, I guess, in some ways, deepened regional divides that were very much there, i.e. maybe some southern nations not having the idea that German pork trickles down in their economy, where other northern member states have the idea that is there. And I think that's important for your question in the sense that actually I think that many Eurosceptic parties started out, and Paul Taggart called that as well, and I did as well, as a touchstone of dissent. So strategic thing that you can do. Wilders, for example, in the Netherlands, left the Liberal Party, start his own party on the Turkish succession issue, or something small, you pick it up, you try to gain traction. But I think actually their message has become, even if they intended it as more strategy than than actually ideology, has become much more credible for exactly that reason, the sense that, well, even in a small country like the Netherlands, the idea is, well, we are also partly, I mean, you call it almost a German term, fremdbestimmt. So we are decided by another big nation about how we should live our lives, and that's seen as unfair and unjust. And it must be it's a message that gains even more traction in the South because of the haircuts, because of perhaps differential treatment with Ireland. And I think that really has created now a group of parties that I think have become Eurosceptic out of both ideology, as well as also realizing that this is a very, very strategic thing to do. And I think the most strategic thing about this is that many mainstream parties are internally extremely divided. The reason why the Conservative Party in Britain wanted to kind of postpone the discussion on the EU in a referendum for UKIP is also because UKIP, could make them marginal in certain districts, because actually some Conservative voters agree with Farage. They might not agree with him on every aspect, but they definitely agree with him on the EU. And for Conservative parties or for Social Democratic parties, there's a lot of internal division. And I think that makes it always a strategy for more extreme right and extreme left parties. But I think extreme left and extreme right parties are not just not just strategic vehicles. I think more and more they're developing a real discourse that lines up either with their anti-immigration discourse or their anti-market discourse, and that they say, you see, we were right, this is what the EU is doing, and that actually nicely fits up with our ideology and happens to also be strategic.
So if you say it often enough, even if you don't believe it, you will come to believe it. It's sort of like religious observance.
Almost. And I think also the thing is that what has changed, at least in the country I know best, I'm Dutch by origin, but the country that I know best is that actually mainstream parties can no longer have it's more difficult to craft an answer against that rhetoric. And I think that we talk about mainstream parties.
I'm sorry, but you're
Not on
up.
Brussels, but on many. Oh, sorry.
Repeat what you just said because we lost you.
Sorry. Well, yeah, one last. So we talk very much about the rise of the extremes, either left or right extremes. But I think what is a very more important story is actually the demise of the political center, that there's many mainstream parties who are not able to resonate anymore with voters on core issues that they care about. And Brussels is only one of those. And it's not just the rise of very clever extremist entrepreneurs, it's also a weakening and a deserting of the center because these parties were no longer delivering.
Thank you. Jean-Luc, I saw you had your hand up.
Yes, thank you. Further to your questions, I think you are absolutely right in making a distinction between what we could call anti-Europe and anti-establishment. If you take all together Eurosceptics, Europhobics, populists, we are an extreme left and extreme right. All together, they would count for around 20% in the new parliament. But I believe, and I would like to be on a positive note, I think that even in those political families, the narrative and exclusively anti-European is extremely limited. I think it's much more likely a question of rejection of the establishment in general. And most of the time, if you go to the electors, the lack of confidence in Europe, in the European institutions, can be high, but most of the time, the confidence in the national state is the level of confidence in the national state is even lower. So, I think we really have to take into consideration this distinction.
I'm reading a note that I can't read. It must be written in Dutch. I just want to acknowledge our sister EU Center at University in Florida. Sorry, FIU, Florida International University. And I know, Christine, that you might have to leave. So before you leave, did you want to ask a question?
Yes, regarding the impact that would be for the impact of these elections abroad, I would like to know. In Europe, we know what's going on, but abroad, what's going to happen?
You mean outside of the EU?
Yes. In the United States.
Anyone want to take a crack at that? Costas, yes.
Where am I?
Yep, there you are.
I think that in terms of signing agreements with other countries, especially now this TTIP agreement going on, my take on it is that I don't expect this particular election to have a major impact on it. And the main reason why I say that is my impression is that the mainstream parties will dominate the European Parliament just like they did in the past, maybe in different sort of proportions, but I expect that the European People's Party and the Socialist Party to be the two dominant ones, and they do have an agenda that's in favor of free trade, of a liberal order. So I expect that free trade agreements or other agreements will go forward. So maybe they may become more sensitive to some of the issues that the other parties are the smaller, the more sort of vocal, extreme parties are concerned. But I don't expect, me anyway, any major impact on this type of agreements. What I think might be a little bit, things may be a little more complicated, is sort of this more diffuse impact that the EU has to the rest of the world, the normative, if you want, appeal that it has. And this is a matter of how the EU deals with these elections and the outcome of these elections. And I would say there is a good precedent in European politics because there have been anti-system parties in European politics for a very long time. So I was thinking about the communists, for example, being major forces in some countries, and they were against the liberal democratic regimes, and political systems in Europe have been able to accommodate them. So I think that it's very important for the EU to accommodate those views, unpleasant as they may be to some people, because that is not only healthy for the EU itself, but it also serves as a model for other countries. So other countries can see how the EU is dealing with these Eurosceptic voices, these anti-system voices. And so when, let's say, Egypt is looking for an example, for a model to emulate of dissenting voices, the EU and the European Parliament can serve as an example of that. So that is, however, something that depends on how the European Union institutions and the European Parliament and politicians in Europe manage these new parties once and if they enter the European Parliament and if they become a major force.
Let me follow up and switch to my own role to panelist and disagree with you, or maybe carry it a little bit further. If this election brings with it in the campaign and the party's rhetoric a lot of very nasty, hostile rhetoric about Brussels trampling our sovereignty and imposing on us economic costs and bringing all these foreign people, doesn't that have the impact of eroding the vaunted soft power of Europe? How appealing will it be to another country to try to join or associate if the message that comes out is, by doing so, you lose your national prerogatives? A fairly provocative thesis that has produced stunned silence. I'm surprised Jean-Luc hasn't jumped out of his chair. Will?
Yeah, I was just there's probably a difference between the way that this sort of soft power might be impacted by the negative press of extremist or anti-system parties in the near neighborhood, I guess, of the EU. So thinking about other Eastern European countries that are not in it. I mean, the anecdote that comes to mind is I remember seeing some great graffiti on a wall in Croatia last year before the joining of the Croats to the EU, saying EU equals Yugoslavia, Brussels equals Belgrade. And so I mean, I think that it's maybe easier to conflate these messages with the closer by countries. However, in terms of what is the impact of the EU on the European Parliament elections outside of Europe, farther outside of Europe, in the US, I think that publicity matters to some extent. And this is definitely the most publicized European Parliament election that I can think of, at least in poring over what has come out of the 04, the 99 elections. I mean, you've got a very unified, well-funded campaign by the Parliament itself, by the EU in general, to sort of mention these elections, and that has an impact on the international press. I mean, I was struck the other day that the European Parliament elections, some speculations about the results were picked up by the AP wire and put into Florence Morning News, which is our local small town paper. And I mean, that the extent to which that's useful information for those of us who study the European Parliament, maybe it's not telling us a whole lot, but to the extent that it's generating some sort of awareness about the EU, its institutions, the programs of them, I think is important to notice, and it certainly made some waves around here, at least.
Well, let me stay with you for a moment, because I think this question is, right, as we say in the United States, in your wheelhouse. I read an analysis that said, essentially, everybody's getting too hysterical about these right-wing groups. What's all the fuss about? They really won't have any impact. And the core of the argument is that because they won't be able to form effective parliamentary groups, families, I believe is the term, European, that nobody will cooperate with them, or even if they do, they will have a small impact. Do you accept that thesis, or is the author missing something?
No, I think that's generally right. I mean, I guess I would go back to my earlier thesis or mention about how all of these parties cannot be generalized with the same brush, right? So some parties that are on the far right or otherwise are ready to work with other similar such parties and would be a threat to forming a group. I mean, if the EFD stays around in the next at the next parliamentary sitting and attract some new members that can have greater institutional power. But right now there are a lot of parties that are stuck out in the NI, which deprives them of real institutional power once the parliament gets started. I mean, these folks are not entitled to the same committee chair allocations and wouldn't be noticed in policy making in terms of rapporteurships, and they're not funded the same way. So if the parties are not willing to play along and work together, then they really will not have that much of an impact. But yeah, I'm not sure if that's always going to be the case. I mean, I've spoken to some of the interviews I've been doing in the parliament recently. I've spoken to some Dutch MEPs from the Geert Wilders party who say, we're not the type of people that are here just to take the allowance and go home and occupy a seat without ever doing anything. We'd like to work with someone, but no one wants to work with us because they think that we're a bunch of fascists. So if that continues to be the trend, then I think it's true that these parties will not be able to unify under a party group and have that much real power in the policy making that comes out of the next European Parliament wave.
Jean-Luc?
Yes, I think that irrespective of whether the extreme right will be able or not to create a group, in my view, the question to analyze whether they are going to interfere and to influence the policy making in the European Parliament is whether they are going to really work in the European institutions, in particular in the Parliament, because so far, and it's not a question of being able to create a political group or not, they haven't, thanks God, I would say, they haven't done absolutely anything. So they've taken the European Parliament as a platform. Farage is a very good example of this. But when it comes to the daily work in the committees, to influence, to table amendments, to negotiate with your colleagues, they are completely out of the game. So, in my view, the question of whether they are going whether they will be able to build, to set up a political group is quite irrespective.
Well, I'm not going to let you off. Oh, yes, ma'am.
My name is Maria José. I know that the theme of our conversation has to do only with the far right, but I'd like to draw our attention to the fact that also in the polls, and I'm using Poll Watch as a reference, we are also observing the possibility for an increase from the usually known as the left united. And I would say, to be provocative, that unless the far right and the left united, which would both be, so the extremists would decide to make a coalition and programmatic agreements, I fully agree with Jean-Luc when he says and when he supports the idea that until now, the non-attached and whereas the far right delegations have been, we don't foresee them to be able to set the political agenda of the European Parliament. And what I'm a little bit surprised is that until now nobody mentioned the possibility that the simple increase on seats, which could be for the non-attached, where we have a mix of politicians and political agendas, including the far right, from 32 to 90 MEPs in a total of 751. We have to put also these numbers into perspective. Nobody mentioned the possibility or the interests that the major mainstream parties, political families, may have in talking to each other to ensure some stability in the institution, in particular, in order to avoid the simple destabilization of the institution. As Jean-Luc just mentioned, in 751 MEPs, when we are talking about 32 as of today, the capacity to influence real political decisions and legislative decisions is quite reduced. If they increase to 90, this is more significant, but however, if the major mainstream political families decide to have a political agreement at the beginning of the term of office in order to ensure the stability, a minimum of stability in the policy making, I believe that it may not be that dramatic, this increase. The second point I'd like to mention is that I fully agree with the professors who mentioned that what is going on in the population and the difference that may exist beyond those who are voting in Central Europe member states and member states who acceded to the European Union and were touched immediately by the economic crisis and thereby could not benefit. And as some other member states could benefit from the accession, I mention in particular those member states from South Europe who have acceded to the European Union in a better situation, economic situations. Where in these member states from Central Europe, it is more easily to see the fact that the population is going towards extremist positions. On the other side, in the Western countries, Western Europe member states, the vote may be more a vote of for internal reasons, to punish the governments in where they are not happy with the policies that have been made. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, if we have demolished the idea that the vote will affect the European Parliament, I don't want to leave you with equanimity, so I'm going to read a quote to you from a study done by the German Institute of International and Security Affairs, which argues as follows. It says, paradoxically, the rise of Eurosceptic parties has seen its gravest political repercussions not in the European Parliament, but in the Council of Ministers. Whereas the tendency to form grand coalitions in the EP has largely excluded the Eurosceptics, as we've said, their electoral successes apply massive pressure on national governments. So this essentially suggests that there will be an impact, but it won't be directly through European Union institutions, or at least the Parliament, but through national governments and their representatives in the Council of Ministers. I see a lot of nodding heads. Go ahead. Yes.
If you allow me, in response to this, I confirm, and I can also tell you that some of the discussions we had, I could observe here today, remind me of some conversations we had in 2010 when I was in the cabinet of Commissioner Janusz Lewandowski dealing with financial programming and budgets during the Eurozone crisis, of the euro crisis, where there were those who were really considering that the euro was going to disappear, it would be a catastrophe, and we were going to fall altogether happily, and some others very unhappily. But as we can see today, the euro is giving the signs that it will stay. And at that occasion, also the big tension was in the Council of Ministers. So it's in the representatives of the member states, as member states, in the EU political structures, the ministers of the national governments, that these tensions appear more often. And the role of the European Parliament has been precisely to ensure that there is this accountability, transparency, and the principles of democratic participation of the citizen through its control of the policy making, as most of the decisions, as my colleagues mentioned, are now made in co-decision by the European Parliament and the Council of Ministers. So what I would say is that I would see more in the future term of office, the tensions between the European Parliament as an institution and the Council to increase, because the central political families, they will be obliged to contain precisely the radicals from left and right to have more assertive political agendas.
Or Bala, is that a signal, or are you keeping yourself awake? I can't tell.
Excuse me, I didn't understand.
I wondered if you were signaling us to speak.
No. I'm just listening with great interest.
Okay. You need to be muted. Before we leave, I wanted to see if any of the participants at Illinois or any of our participants here at the University of Pittsburgh would like to ask a question. Harry, just identify yourself.
My name is Harry Klapsis. I'm an undergraduate student here at the University of Pittsburgh. And my question is mainly focused on the situation in Greece. And Kostas can correct me if I'm wrong here, but in Greece, it seems like the European Parliament elections are acting as a referendum on Samaras government. And he has a very, very weak coalition right now, and it's possible that he might fall. So is this something that we've seen in other European states where the European Parliament elections are moving up from being a secondary election, being a second order election, being a first order election, where it might actually influence the domestic politics as well? And correct me if I'm wrong, Costa, that it's not a referendum on, if you believe it's not a referendum.
I can't speak about all the other countries. But I do find that in the case of Greece actually proves again the second order election thesis, because what is happening right now, as you pointed out, is there's two things going on. Citizens are trying to express their dissatisfaction with government policies that are obviously strongly promoted by the European Union. But there is something else going on that I think is very interesting, and the Greek case illustrates. What happened in Greece is essentially the center collapsed after the crisis. Central party just completely collapsed. And so what everybody's doing, so there are all these new parties that are emerging, and I cannot even keep track of them because there's different parties popping up all the time. But what's interesting is that they see the European Parliament election as an opportunity to test their powers, to test their appeal to the citizens, because the real election in quotation marks, at least that's the discourse seems to suggest, is the national election that will come up. Okay, so it seems to me that it's both. So it seems to me anyway, and I could be wrong, and I just can talk about that one case, that the status of the European Parliament election as a second order election is confirmed. Not only because people express views, and I think that's why we see some of these anti-European attitudes are much more pronounced than perhaps they would be in a national election later, but also because it's an opportunity for new parties to test their power and see if they can actually, they're viable or not in the future.
That actually produces what will be my final question. We're going to call it the Kostas thesis, which is that the elections in the parliament might produce a resonance in national politics or elections in other European countries. So, Dr. Gunz, do you think that's likely in the Central European countries? In other words, this will be a platform, and then it'll have an impact on the quote real election.
Well, I wouldn't like to speak for other countries, but in Hungary, it is certainly true, especially that now the situation is a little bit reversed. The European elections are like 2 months after national elections. So it is not the pre-test of national elections and the performance of the political parties, but it is coming after national elections. So obviously these 2 months, or not even 2 months, is not enough to put any kind of real European issues on the table. So it will be pretty much, I think, just the repetition of national elections. But we'll see.
Good political scientist always ends with "we'll see." Professor De Vries, is it too much of a stretch to think that the European Parliament elections would have an impact on the forthcoming referendum in Scotland or the following referendum in Great Britain itself?
No, I think basically this is an enormous test case for UKIP. It looks like it will be the biggest party, and that's going to put a lot of pressure on one possible referendum and one clear referendum, and especially if the Scots would decide to leave. For those of us in the rest of the UK who would not like UK to leave the European Union, is going to be very difficult because, as you know, Scots are actually much more on average, much more pro-European than the average Brit. So that's going to have really enormous consequences. And the last part of what I want to say in terms of the question about, I do think maybe actually now, going back to your very first question, something has changed in the sense that national elections can sometimes be about Europe. European parliamentary elections can sometimes be about national. And I think what we've seen is much more of an interplay that these different electoral contexts affect both European politics and national politics. And that is maybe something that we didn't predict, let's say 15 years ago, or, like, let's say at the end of the 90s. So although I do think that European parliamentary elections still have a quite second order nature to it, it doesn't mean that Europe doesn't matter there. It also doesn't mean that Europe doesn't matter in national elections.
I like that thesis. I like it even more than the Costas thesis because it's just vague enough to let us wriggle out from under it when we need to. The intersection of national and international. Before I leave, I want to be sure that I haven't missed a question from Illinois. If there's anyone there who would like to ask a question.
Ron, thanks for the opportunity. I think everything is clear. No questions from the students.
Thank you, Matt. Well, if everything is clear, that will be the first of our conversations that has ended that way. But I do want to take this opportunity to thank you all for participating, all of you at Illinois, including Costas, Professor De Vries from Oxford, Dr. Guntz from Budapest, and Will from South Carolina, which has just applied to join the EU from what I've heard. And of course, the European Parliament Liaison Officer, it was a pleasure to have you with us. And thank you all for your participation, and we'll see you next year. Thank you.